Hello everyone and welcome to round 5 of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament in Wijk aan Zee, the Netherlands. In this video we'll have a look at the game between Niels Grandelius and world champion Magnus Carlsen. Now before this round Niels was on half a point out of 4 and Magnus was on 2.5, so Magnus was only half a point behind the leaders, and when you're playing one of the bottom seeds you definitely need a win. Anyway, so let's have a look at what happened. So Niels played pawn e4, and c5 by Magnus. So Magnus playing with the black pieces, he knows he needs to win, that's why he plays Sicilian, knight f3, and knight c6 by Magnus. So Magnus is inviting Niels to play the Rosso Limo, but Niels just wants to play the open Sicilian. So Magnus trades and goes pawn to e6. Alright, so Magnus has very often played this Sveshnikov variation, but there are many ways for white to keep the game solid there. So Magnus plays the move e6, which leads to the Taimanov. Then Niels also had this opening against Richard Rapport in round number 3, in which Niels played the move g4. But in this game he chooses one of the main moves, bishop e3 and a6 by Magnus. Now here the main moves have always been queen to d2 and queen f3, but Niels once again goes for this move g4. So it's very similar to what he had against Richard, but the difference is that he played bishop e3 first. Alright, so here Magnus traded on d4 and played b5. And apparently this was all still preparation by Niels. He played very, very fast. He went long castles, bishop e7, f3, and after rook c8, queen to d2. Alright, now here it's not that easy for black to develop. I mean, he can go something like knight f6, but you will always get hit by g5. And where do you go with the knight? I mean, you can go to h5, but then white can play bishop h3 very quickly and bishop g4, attack your knight. So it's not that easy for Magnus to develop. So instead he goes bishop to b4, hitting the knight. Niels goes bishop to d4 to defend and hit the pawn on g7. Now once again Magnus can go knight to f6, but I guess he had his reasons not to. Maybe again some move like g5 would have been annoying for black. So instead of all that he plays f6, and he's ready here to play e5, hit the bishop on d4, and if the bishop moves he can take the knight on c3. But Niels is one move faster. He goes a3, oh no, sorry. He goes g5, hitting the pawn on f6. Magnus goes h6, we see a trade on h6, and now a3, hitting the bishop on b4. Now black can drop the bishop back to e7, let's say, but after rook g1, it looks like white's a bit better. The pawn on g7 is kind of awkward to protect, and black doesn't really have enough counterplay on the queen side. So what Magnus does, he goes bishop takes a3, b takes an e5. Now the problem for white is here that if he moves the bishop, he's going to lose the knight here. You can play someone like bishop e3, but after takes, you can take on d7, but it doesn't really work out for white because his pawn on c2 is under attack and your bishop on e3 is also hanging. So that's why Niels takes on b5 first, hitting the queen, and after Magnus recaptures, he drops his bishop back to b2 to have a little bit more solidity around his king. And here Magnus comes up with quite a surprising move. He goes d5. Alright, so inviting Niels to take a pawn with check, and now he goes king to f8. And even though Magnus is down a pawn, his king could be safer in the long term, and the position is very, very complicated. But I think here's where Niels made a mistake. He probably should have chosen queen before check, and after king g8, queen to b3. The idea is to guard this pawn on c2, and also to pin this pawn on d5, which you can capture on the next move. It's still very, very unclear after, let's say, someone like knight f7 takes a knight to d6, but white should be better. I mean, after all, he's up 2 pawns, and after someone like rook d3 and rook c3, it's kind of unclear where the black compensation is. But of course, this is all very, very complicated, and instead of that, Niels played the move bishop a4. So the nice move about bishop a4 is that it guards the pawn on c2, and he's ready to go, let's say, bishop b3, and put some pressure on this long diagonal. Now Magnus goes d4, keeping things a bit more closed, and Niels goes bishop b3, putting the bishop on the diagonal. Magnus goes knight f7, making way for the rook, and making sure the king can always sit here or go knight d6. So Niels gives a check on b4, Magnus goes king to g8, and rook d2 by Niels to make sure that this pawn is always protected, to make sure that this pawn is always protected. Maybe he can double up the rooks in the future. Anyway, Magnus goes bishop a6. So now he's ready to go rook b8, hit the queen, and potentially the bishop, because the bishop, this pawn on c2 is pinned. Right, so Niels goes f4, good move, trying to open up lines towards the king. Magnus goes rook b8, queen a4, and bishop b5, hitting the queen. Niels goes queen to b4, and here a bit surprising, like Magnus decides to repeat the position once. I don't know like if that was the correct decision, because he was up a little bit of time on the clock, and with the repetition the players get closer to move 40, and they also gain a minute on the clock, because you gain 30 seconds for every move. Anyway, in this position, Magnus went rook to h3, a very interesting move. Like he wants to put pressure on the bishop on h3, and just also activate this rook. Anyway, Niels trades on e5, Magnus recaptures, and rook g1 by Niels. Now he's ready to go rook d to g2, pressure this pawn here, and things are not that easy for Magnus. Now he played bishop to e2. But here, like, ideally Magnus would have liked to play a move like bishop a6, but here's where things get very, very wild. After bishop a6, Niels would have probably taken on f7, and now it's pretty complicated. You cannot take with the queen, because that leaves your rook hanging and you lose the game. And if you take with the king, white always has this intermezzo, rook d to g2, and hitting this pawn with a check. So the move Magnus should have played here is the move king to h8. All right, now things are tricky. So this queen is under attack. Now what happens if you slide the king, if you slide the queen over? If you go queen to a4, black's going to take an f7, and it looks like black's losing a piece, because white can take the bishop on a6, but guess what? There's the move queen to a2, hitting the bishop, and now all of a sudden white's king is in a lot of trouble. You cannot play a move like c3 to guard, because there's always problems like pawn takes c3, and if you take, well, you get checkmated over here. But it's not that easy. After king h8, white has the amazing move rook g3. Now, if you take the queen, you get checkmated, because the bishop covers this square. Now, so what if you trade rooks here first, and then take the queen? Well, guess what? Rook h2, checkmate, because the bishop is still covering this square. So what black should have done after the move rook g3 is rook to h6, with the point being that if white goes queen a4, we take an f7, and now this bishop is protected, and we're going for our own attack with queen a2. The rook can potentially also slide over here. But this is all very, very difficult to figure out over the board. So instead of that, Magnus played bishop to e2. Niels traded, king takes, and now queen a4. So once again, both kings are pretty exposed, but there's no easy way through here. Magnus played queen to b7, hitting the pawn. Queen b4 by Niels to guard. Queen c7, and once again queen a4. So once again a repetition. But I mean, Magnus is not going to take a quick draw here, right? Instead, he played bishop b5, hitting the queen. And here things look difficult for, oh, not that, of course. Things look difficult for Niels. I mean, maybe queen b4 has to be played, but then he's getting into discovery. But here Niels found an amazing move. He played rook d to g2. All right, so, I mean, isn't he just hanging his queen? Well, if Magnus takes, there's rook takes g7. And you're going to win the queen on the next move. And actually, if you go king e6, things are even worse, because you get checkmated, because the rooks cover the 6th and the 7th rank. So instead of all that, Magnus goes rook h7 to guard the pawn on g7. Niels gives a check on b3, bishop c4, and queen g3. And here things get very tricky, because all of a sudden the king on c1 is fairly safe, and he has his own threats towards the pawn on g7. If Magnus plays a move like queen b7, for example, there's queen takes g7, you sacrifice the queen, but at the end of it all, you win back the queen on b7. Once again, you cannot step up, because you get checkmated. And I mean, if you go back, white's up a pawn, and has all the chances. White's actually up 2 pawns, and has all the chances in the world to win here. So instead of that, Magnus goes queen b6, but now Niels goes queen g6 and trading the queens. So Niels is still up a pawn, but Magnus is fairly active. He's hitting h2, bishop d3 could always be a threat, hitting this, hitting this. So here Niels should have played a move like king to b1, and Magnus, he can take on h2, but then comes rook takes g7, and it should probably end in a draw. But at the 40th move, Niels let down his guard. So on move 40, you get an additional 50 minutes, that's generally the time control. But unfortunately here he made a mistake. He played rook 6 to g5, hitting this pawn, but perhaps he overlooked Magnus' reply bishop to d3. Now this pawn is this pawn on c2 is under attack. This pawn on e4 is also under attack, and you can't take on e5, because then black's going to take here with a check on your king. If you go king b1, there's rook g2 with a check on the king, and you're losing your rook. And if you go king d1, you're losing your bishop over here. So Niels played rook f5 check, king g8, and rook f2 to guard. And here Magnus came up with a very, very strong move. He played rook to h6. And here things are getting very, very tricky for white. If white plays the move king to b1, which looks alright, right? Because now the bishop's under attack, you're getting out of this pin. Black has the amazing rook takes c2. White is forced to recapture, and now black takes the pawn on h2. So if black can take on c2, he will be up a pawn. Once again, his pawns are also very, very strong. But white still has to move rook c1. Right? And you might be thinking like, wait, what does black gain from this? If he takes on c2, he will be down a bishop. So this doesn't make any sense. But guess what black does? In this position, white is completely stuck. You cannot move a single piece. So what does black do? g5. Just pushing this pawn up the board. If you go a4, g4, nothing is going to stop this pawn. And at the right moment, black is going to trade and then go g3. And once again, this bishop is simply not able to get in time to stop this pawn. So after king c2, now you take the rook, and this pawn is simply going to decide the game. So that is why king b1 cannot be played. Instead of that, Niels played the move rook to d1, hitting the bishop. And here's where Magnus probably missed his last chance of the game. He should have played the move rook f6, after which things are very, very complicated. Now let's have a look at what happens if Niels takes that rook. Here, since the rook is no longer protecting the pawn, Magnus can take the pawn on c2, king b1, and rook d2 check. Alright, so if you go king a2, you lose the game because black gives a check, king b1 you take, and you just force the king away from this rook, and only now you take the rook on f6. Anyway, all very, very complicated, but really what would have been the most intriguing is if white would have played king c1, the only move in the position. Black trades on d1 and then takes on f6. And here we have a very, very interesting opposite color bishop endgame. We see that white has the two outside passers, but black is going to take this pawn on e4, and then we'll have three connected passers in the center. And it's very, very hard to judge whether this is winning or if it's a draw. But during the broadcast, Hikaru and I, we couldn't quite figure out how white is drawing here. So this would have been really Magnus's last chance to win. And I think he would have had pretty good winning chances here. Anyway, instead of all that, Magnus took the pawn on e4. And now rook e1. And this is kind of awkward for black, because you probably have to move the bishop. I mean, if you move the bishop, you're going to hang the pawn on e5. So Magnus played rook h4. But after a4, he's really kind of stuck. I mean, this rook is kind of stuck defending this bishop over here. The bishop cannot move because then you're going to hang this. The king is kind of cut off by this rook. So there doesn't seem to be an easy way here for Magnus to make progress. So he played rook to c5, but now came bishop a3, hitting the rook, rook c8, and bishop e7. So trying to dislodge the rook from the defense of the bishop on e4, Magnus played rook to g4, h3 by Niels, rook g2, we saw a trade, and now Niels takes the pawn on e5. Magnus plays d3, trying to create an attack on the pawn on c2, but Niels easily has it covered with the move bishop c5. Rook a8 by Magnus, Niels took the pawn on d3, Magnus took the pawn on a4, and after king to d2, bishop takes h3, everything is disappearing from the board, and after rook e4, a draw was agreed. There's simply nothing both sides can do, and yeah. So yeah, very, very exciting game here between Niels Grandelius and Magnus Carlsen. Magnus missing some chances here and there to try to get the win, but overall in such a complicated game, it's very difficult to criticize the world champion. Magnus is still half a point behind the leaders. He definitely needs to win tomorrow with the white pieces to try to get into the lead. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.